Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, it's the second in a series of slow stitch cactus, particularly houseplants cactus. I take advantage of the bright colors and the very unique shapes to each type of plant. And then I incorporate different ways to use textiles or stitches to really make them come alive. In today's video, we're going to use a technique using French knots to create the string of pearls plant. Now this is a very elegant plant. It's delicate and lacy, and it drapes down, almost looking like running water, just with little teeny leaves that are really little pieces of cactus. I make the subject into a hanging plant, so I have 3 ropes that I stitch, and I just use a split stitch to make the rope. But use your favorite stitch, whether it's a chain stitch, a split stitch, or a back stitch. And here's how I do it. So here's my sampler of different cactus. Today's video, we're going to work on this little string of pearls cactus. Now this is kind of unusual because it's not a flat cactus. It's not a big cactus. It's made up of these teeny little small pieces of succulent, and it drapes and does interesting things. Some can really carry on the length of a table, or they can be hung, and we're going to make a hanging plant today just to make it a little different than just a standard potted plant. And this is also a little different because we're going to use a lot of thread and less fabric. So let me show you how I make my design. So here I have 3 colors of green. I have a darker green and then 2 lighter greens because that succulent, that little string of pearls, is a lighter succulent. I'm also going to use this beautiful purple as my pot, and I want to make it hanging. So I'll have 3 little ropes that it hangs from. So the first thing I'll do is create my pot. And I just want it to be kind of a rectangular shape. So it'll just come this way. And I'll have my plant coming out from it. So I'll create that shape and then cut it. And I can even just cut it in half just so that it's nice and symmetrical. Make it a little larger than my sketch because I can always cut it down. And because I know I'm going to have it drape, I'll have it maybe in the center of the piece. I'm going to have my cactus drape from it. And then I want to have my 3 ropes coming right from the pot. And I'm just going to stop them up about here. On this one over here, I'm just going to start stitching about this way, this far up, because I don't want that rope showing through. I want that cactus to come out. And I also don't want that cactus necessarily to be rounded. I want it to kind of come up and down. So I'll just kind of make that light little sketch, and then I can make my little vine coming down from it. It's not really a vine, but I just need to have a little bit of an idea of where to go with it. I'm just going to pin my little pot in place, and then I'm going to take that thread and stitch it down. Now I know I'm going to stitch through the thread with my green to make that cactus. So I'll make my stitches kind of on the outside and then on the bottom, and I'll leave the top open, at least for now. So again, I'm just going to do a straight stitch. Do whatever stitch you like. This is really just the purpose was to tack it down. So I'll do a few stitches, leaving a nice little space around them. Going about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'll show you how it looks when it's all stitched down. So there I have my little pot stitched down. I left a little gap over here because I think I'm going to make a little drape of the plant coming from there as well. And now I'm going to make lots and lots of French knots. I'm going to start with my dominant color. I have a lighter green, this dominant color, which is a little more of a lush green. And then I have this beautiful darker green. I'm going to use the darker green and the lighter green as accents. So the majority of my stitches, and there will be plenty of them, will be of this color here. What I want to do is have the larger of my French knots, because all of my plants here, all of my string of pearls are just going to be individual French knots. But I'm going to have the larger ones closest to the pot, and as they move away from the pot, they'll get smaller and smaller. So I'm going to start by making a series of French knots very close to the top of this pot, but on the background piece. and it'll have 4 wraps around my needle. So I pull my needle through my fabric, take my needle, and I wind it around 2, 3, 4, and I hold a little tension here on my left hand because I'm right-handed. Then I'm going to take that needle and go down next to it, piercing that fabric where I came up from, and I'm still holding that thread with my thumb a little taut. Not terribly taut, but firm. Then I'm going to pull my thread through, again keeping that taut, and then pull it down, and I get a nice taut little knot. Then I'll just skip a space, and I'll do the same thing again. And again, I'm going to keep 4 or 5 wraps around my needle. By doing an extra one or one less, it will vary the size of these knots. Again, keep a little tension there, pull my thread through, and at the last minute, let it go. And I'll continue making a series of these knots around the top of where this planter ends and the background begins. So I'll make a few more. Using that same procedure and that same color, and show you how it looks. You don't have to make an evenly spaced area because we'll fill them in with the other colors and with smaller knots as we progress. This part of the project is very time consuming, but this is where you get that very interesting texture as an end result from using all these French knots. So now I have just enough thread left to make one more French knot comfortably. And you can see the back of my fabric here, how it looks. I'm going to set this aside, so I'm going to pull my thread and just stick my needle on the base of my fabric, and I just want to stitch those ropes. So I have my purple thread that matches the flower pot. You can use any color you want. I'm going to start just above this last knot that I have here, and I'm going to use a split stitch. So I make a stitch and I come through the center of that stitch. You can use whatever stitch you want. I think a stem stitch is a nice stitch to use for this, or chain stitch. It just gives interesting texture, and that's the whole point of the split stitch as well, is it kind of splits the stitch and it gives a little more body than just a straight stitch. So I'll continue going up the length here to make these hanging ropes for this plant. And as I said, on the center rope, I'm going to start halfway up, and down here on the rope that's the opposite of this one, I'll do the same thing and end just a little bit up. So I'll stitch them and show you that result. And so now I've stitched all of the hanging rope, and I have my thread here still attached to my needle of the green thread. This is what the back of the piece looks like. I'm going to create another knot over here so I can start my little drape of the French knots. This one's going to be just 5 wraps, a little bit smaller than the last one I worked on. I want to gradually work my way down. I'm going to come out just a little further. I'll do another knot, if I can manage it, with just 5 wraps. And come in. And then I'll knot off my thread. I'll restring my needle and continue to add to these knots here. I'll add up to here, gradually reducing the size from 5 or 6 wraps of the needle to about 4 when I get up top here. So I'll just fill in this area up top, and I'll wait to do over here, and I'll show you how that looks. So I finished stitching all the way up top here, and I decided to stitch a little bit right on top of the fabric little hanging pot here. Not only does it hold the fabric down, but it blurs that line so it's not just a straight edge. So now I want to work on creating French knots that trail off the piece, off the pot, so it looks like that string of pearls. I'm going to start again with my main color, and I'll just come down, and I'll show you on one side here. I'm going to dovetail off these pieces I've already started, these little French knots. So I'll come right up beneath it and follow that line that I sketched out, again making those French knots. So I'll wrap it 4 times around, stitch back into my fabric, and then I'll continue down on a kind of curved line, stitching, and I'll vary the number of threads around the needle. Again, making that line. Now as I continue to go down, I'll reduce the number of wraps on my needle to 2 and then just to 1. And this is just to make the parts of the plant look smaller. It adds a little complexity to our piece. Again, I'm not working on spacing them evenly because I don't want it to look like a trail. I just want it to look like hanging plants, like very organic, and have that vine shape where it just drapes. So now I'm switching to just 1 wrap around the needle, and you can see, particularly from the top to the bottom, how much thicker it is up top. I don't have to make all of my knots touch. Some can touch and others don't, and that just gives it a very interesting kind of floating effect. And I'll just make this as long as I want. I'll just go a little further, skipping around because it helps me to design it to see how it will look when it comes to that point. So I'll come back in here, add another knot, and I'll just do 1 more over here at the end. So I have that 1 trail. I'll do another trail on this side, and then I want to trail it down a little shorter right in the center. I might not even stitch off those little flower pot. I'll just come down a little bit. And I'll show you how that looks, and then we could start adding a little dimension with the other 2 colors of thread. So now I'll just come in with my darker thread and just fill in some of these gaps. Again, I'll make small little knots, just wrapping my thread around my needle 2 or 3 times, just to give a little variation on the colors here. And I'll do the same thing with the lighter color thread. So I like to start at the vines, and again, I'm adding much fewer knots in these different colors than my main color. I just want a little variation. And I work my way up the vine, incorporating more knots. And I'll do the same thing with the color that's just slightly lighter than the one we have as well. And I'll show you the finished piece. So I have my French knots all stitched around here in varying sizes, and it creates a very interesting effect with the light and the dark, and then my average color here. So that's how I create a string of pearls cactus plant. So that's how I create the string of pearls plant. It's a fun technique using classic stitches. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.